The Sharp-Eyed Chicken Network is on the air. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, whenever time you're watching this. I want to begin tonight's this discussion with a reminder of the way I opened the first one, which is to say, first of all, we have to remember that all generalizations are false, including this one, and that you don't have to worry about that because I never tell the truth, and that is the truth. Because there will be a lot of generalities included in this discussion, and you have to remember that there are exceptions to everything I say, but in the English language, you can't have a really interesting discussion about anything important without having to say more often than not most of the time, and I try to do it whenever it's absolutely necessary, but no more than necessary. So the subject I'm going to open with, and this issue, is debt. Big deal. Debt is a very big deal. It's a huge albatross that's hanging around the neck of the entire world right now. Individuals, governments, the whole human race. And I want to begin by talking about a really remarkable concept that shows up in the Old Testament in the book of Leviticus, which is known as the Jubilee year. Now, when I started investigating this subject, I started the wrong way by actually getting my old Revised Standard Version of the Bible out and reading the particular chapters in Leviticus, and oh boy, it's easy to see why the Catholic Church didn't want people to read the Bible, because it can be very confusing. It's written in very elaborate, abstruse, difficult to understand language. So I then went to our modern Bible, you might say, called Google, looked up Jubilee here, discovered that an organization called Christianity.com has given us the best summary of the Jubilee year, which isn't immediately obvious when you read the Old Testament in the Revised Standard Version. And that summary is that it insists that that all debts be erased, that property be returned to its original owners, and that slaves be manumitted, which is to say, freed from their slavery. Radical concepts, to be sure. Now, just for the record, the rabbis in the post-Christian era, in the immediate post-Christian era, who were rewriting the Talmud, decided that it was inconvenient and impractical, so they decided not to emphasize it, but it's still there in the Bible for the sake of fundamentalists who believe the Bible is the literal word of God. They should give it a little more attention, perhaps. So where does it come from? Well, you know, around 600 BC, a Babylonian dictator, emperor named Nebuchadnezzar attacked and subdued Israel, trashed the first temple, which they attributed to Solomon, captured a very large number of Israelis, and took them into exile in Babylon. Now, one of the things that you don't regularly hear about, but that I have been able to determine from my own scholarship, is that nearly all of those who were taken into exile were the economic and political elite of Israel, because they're the ones he was most worried about. So it turned out that probably what most likely happened was that once they were gone, the ordinary people went, oh my goodness, God, we can actually own our own property now, and we can actually have our own, get the benefit of our own crops. We're not giving up a certain percentage all the time to these elites. So now what happened is that after a considerable period of time, almost a century probably, 50, 60 years at least, what happened is that a Persian emperor named Cyrus conquered Nebuchadnezzar. And when he started looking over this Babylonian package that he had picked up in the process, he decided it was just too much of a nuisance to keep the Israelis there, so he decided he would send the Israelis back to Israel. It was the end of the exile, if you were. Although it turns out, as I've studied it recently, a great many of those Jews didn't go back. Didn't go back to Israel. Went to other parts of the Middle East, and it was one of the beginning. It was the beginning of the their diaspora around the world eventually. But anyway, so the ones that were going back had this problem, what's called, the people are not going to be all that happy to see us, because we're going to be taking them over again and telling them what to do and taking 10% of everything they make and everything. So what they did was they actually indulged in a major project, which again, you have to really dig to find this out. It's not taught typically, but it's largely true. They rewrote large parts of the Bible to justify their coming back in and taking over. And they took a lot of stuff, when they were rewriting the Bible, they took a lot of stuff that was part of the ancient Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Fertile Valley, 2,000 or 3,000 year civilizations that they had been visiting during that exile. Not the least of which was this concept of debt forgiveness, because it turns out that that concept had been around for a very long time in that part of the world, because when you keep an essentially similar culture for 2,000 or 3,000 years, what they discovered was that if they didn't have rules like this, forgiving debts, freeing slaves, and returning property, what happened is that a very small number of people soon had control of everything. It just seems to be an inevitable aspect of human nature. That not human nature, but the nature of some humans, for sure, which we have already previously discussed, is largely a question of the fact that a great many of them are existential cowards who need power and wealth and everything as a compensation for their fears. So that was one of the things that they discovered and carried with them when they went back to Israel. Some of the other things, by the way, that are very interesting were the whole idea of the flood. It goes back to Gilgamesh and ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian legends. The concept of the Garden of Eden, which was supposed to have been located in southern Iraq down near the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates. A lot of what is in the Old Testament was added in later, partly to justify their re-inhabiting of Israel. Now, the concept of debt of canceling debt is not a new idea at all, as I've just said, thousands of years. But it's also fairly recent in Western civilization, because it turns out, in investigating this, that I've discovered that sometime around the late 17th century in England, after their episode with Cromwell, and after they cut off the head of Charles I and went without a king for a while, the idea that the country survived somehow without a king created an entire group of philosophers who were getting the benefit of some of the early Enlightenment, you might say, and they called themselves the Levelers. And guess what? Their chief message to the people, the Levelers, and of course they were anathema to the Charles II and to other kings subsequently. They were considered very dangerous. But what they talked about was forgiving debt, universal suffrage, and basic human rights. In fact, they laid the groundwork for the things that Thomas Paine and the other American revolutionaries used as a basis for their revolution 100 years later. But again, debt forgiveness was a major issue for them as well. So in the process of all this, what we keep coming up, oh, and by the way, there's also a modern group, wonderful modern group called the Debt Collective, which you can look up on the internet. I think they're based in LA, and they have a very similar basic set of regulations of desires, not the least of which is forgiving all debts. My little book that I haven't talked much about, but that I will at some future date, includes a concept that I call Debt Forgiveness Day, and that goes back to a radio, again, back to radio again. On CBS radio network for many years there was a commentator named Charles Osgood. And I used to listen to him every day because he always had something really interesting to say. And one day he told a story about a grocer in New Hampshire who had been having a problem in which his neighborhood customers had run up such enormous debts with him that they weren't coming around and buying groceries anymore. So he ran up an advertisement in the paper that said, to my beloved customers, your debts are forgiven, please come back, I need your business. Oh my goodness. Where did you get that idea, Charles? And what I want to say is that when I talk about debt forgiveness, and I know it's a thought experiment, it's not actually going to happen, but it's worth talking about. But just imagine for a minute that suddenly, somehow or other, by a wave of the hand, all the debts of the world were suddenly forgiven. There would be a huge gasp of relief and joy around the planet, because there are countries and individuals who are living desperate lives trying to compensate, trying to pay off their debts. And we would have economic growth and prosperity that's unimaginable. And who would get hurt in the process? So again, pardon me if I get specific and sound unpleasant here, but the fact is that usury, which is to say making money from money, which I talked about with Hip Miller last session. How does money make money? Making money from money, which is usury, has been a sin, a mortal sin in most major religions for a long time. In fact, in the Christian church, it was a major sin. In Muslims, in the original Islam, and still to some degree considers it a bad practice. But on the other hand, meaning no slur here, the truth of the matter is that Judaism includes no such restrictions. So that during the Middle Ages, when various kings wanted to fight wars for their various disagreements and property, attempts to seize other people's property or whatever it was, but Europe had a series of almost endless wars. Whenever they had a war, they needed to raise money to pay the soldiers, and the Catholics and the Muslims were not going to loan them money, so they had to turn to the Jews to get the money to pay for it. And that's the reason that we have this Protocols of Zion and all this ridiculous anti-Semitic crap about the Jews controlling the banking industry, but it's true up to a certain point that they were the only ones who were willing to do it. So during the late Middle Ages and into the modern era, most of the banks were in fact in most of the major Wall Street firms were formed by Jewish families. Because it wasn't against their religion, they could go ahead and do it. But usury is what it sounds like. It's basically a burden. And it has been a major, since basically in the last 200 years or so, it has been a major means of financing governments. And at this point, you may know that our American government has a huge debt, national debt, huge, which was not a big problem as long as interest rates were so low. But when we had the inflation surge recently and the Federal Reserve decided to raise interest rates to cut back on inflation, what happened, of course, was that our budget suddenly became much more of a burden in this country because the servicing the debt became much more expensive. Also, just for the record, what happened is that when interest rates were very low, banks filled their inventories with bonds that had low interest rates. When interest rates go up, the value of bonds go down. So some of the recent bank failures were directly attributed to the fact that their bond portfolio was suddenly virtually worthless. And they had no way of seeing it coming, and they hadn't prepared for it. So anyway, that's enough about that. Next thing I want to talk about is hierarchies. Because kings at the head of these hierarchies, again, had a big role in creating all this debt. You've just seen a picture of a statue, and the statue is of Khufre, who was the son of Khufu. Khufu was the 4th dynasty pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid, and Khufre was his son, who built a pyramid of his own and also had commissioned the making of the Sphinx in his own image. Now, the most important character in that illustration you've just seen is not Khufre, actually, or Khufu himself, but Horus, the falcon god. I first encountered that statue in an art history class, and in art history they teach you that that Horus is embracing the king, reassuring him and whispering words of wisdom in his ear. Nonsense. The fact is, I have actually done considerable research on that species, and the posture that Horus is assuming at the back of the pharaoh's head is exactly the posture that they assume when they are having sexual intercourse. I'm convinced that the Egyptian elite knew very well when they made this statue, even though they wouldn't make it public record, that they were talking about the unnaturalness of hierarchies, because what the Horus is doing is basically he is injecting divine whatever into the parietal notch of the pharaoh to enable him to justify an extremely unnatural situation in which one person had that much power over that many others, by saying it's okay, you're different, you're better, you're smarter, you're made different, you're meant to be the ruler. You know, I'm the god and I'm telling you you're meant to be the king. And basically it's a description of the justification for the divine right of kings. So now let's think about the pyramids. The Egyptians were really big on symbolism. They thought in symbols. And you cannot imagine a better symbol of a hierarchy than a pyramid. It's a pyramid. It's all one big pyramid scheme. Because what is the pyramid? It's got a thing at the top that's a tribute to the one man or small group of men who created it. And then going down, it's the people who supervised the people who built it, and the mass of it was built by slaves. And I have to tell you that traditionally in Egyptian history, those two guys are not thought of as cultural heroes, but as tyrants, because they were. even though the Egyptians are justifiably proud of the achievement that their slave ancestors created in building those amazing pyramids. But pyramids are a perfect picture of what a hierarchy looks like, as opposed to, by the way, to a heterarchy, which is horizontal distribution of power instead of vertical. And of course, for most of human history, starting with the domestication of plants and animals, which I've already mentioned previous session, as surplus was created, these people who were more interested in power and having power over their fellow humans created these hierarchies, and eventually they became kings. And the kings, for most of our history and in most parts of the world, the kings have claimed that they had divine right to their position. Where did that come from? Well, the chief assistants of the kings were priests. Not a coincidence. And in fact, in the earliest pre-literate societies, besides the chief, which was just a job description more than somebody who lorded over everybody else all the time, the next most important people were the priests or the shamans, who had some way of explaining the natural phenomena of things that were going on. Humans have always been curious about why things are happening, made up plenty of stories about why they are happening. So the divine, as I was saying earlier, the divine right of kings in England got a severe disruption with the Puritan insurrection of the 17th century, in which first King Charles was beheaded and then Cromwell ran the country for 40, 50 years. And even now, there are kings all over the place in Europe who have very little power. They have constitutions and they have parliaments and they have legislative bodies and whatever, but they still claim that their position is divine, is a divinely inspired position. My wife was raised a Catholic, and as you must know, the Catholics in those days were told they weren't supposed to ever read the Bible because it would just confuse them. The priests would tell them what they needed to know. But I was immersed in the Bible. I'm the son and grandson of fundamentalist ministers. I grew up with the Bible, so much so that when I went to boarding school, the first 2 years, I had mandatory Bible classes, and I never had to study for them, and I could still get A's on the courses because it was all internalized. I've been a subscriber for more than a quarter of a century to a wonderful little magazine called the Biblical Archaeological Review, which is tremendously educational, but is also controversial because, as you might imagine, they regularly have to publish letters from fundamentalists who are angry at them because the archaeologists not only can't find evidence of many of the stories that are in the Bible, but find evidence that's completely contrary to the stories that are in the Bible. That's an old controversy between science and religion, as you know. One of my all-time heroes was a man named Thomas Paine. You may have heard of him. He wrote Common Sense, which was the most important influence on the American Revolution. I'm reading his biography right now. And Thomas Paine had a wonderful line about, he was against monarchies, and he had a wonderful line about it, which he said, "Virtue is not hereditary." And there's plenty of evidence that around the world. And of course, the other thing about all that hierarchy and all that divinity business is that they tend to intermarry because they have to they only can justify being married to members of their own elite class. And when they keep intermarrying, what they end up with is congenital diseases. There's got to be some kind of karma there. And of course, in Egypt, they took it to such extremes that brothers only married sisters, and that was just too weird to believe. But they believed that was the only way they could maintain their elite status. And I think I'm running out of things to say right now, but I have plenty to say about this in the future, and I want to go back and summarize the most important thing about this, which is this concept of the Jubilee year, because to those fundamentalists who believe that the Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God, they should be rallying behind the concept of debt forgiveness, and yet they're actually rallying behind the devil incarnate, Donald J. Trump, so go figure. But this concept goes way back and has been embraced by many groups and people along the way, and it's something we need to give a lot of thought to, because ultimately what I'm going to talk about next time is bankruptcy, which is the ultimate solution to debt. And that's another wonderful subject, which I'll get around to next time. So thank you for your attention, and I'll say good night.